Your Excellencies, distinguished leaders, heads of delegations, and esteemed members of the global community, today I stand before you not just as India's External Affairs Minister, but as a voice for all who have been left vulnerable by a global system that is fraying under the weight of crisis. The phrase systemic failure of multilateralism captures a growing disillusionment with the institutions and mechanisms that were originally designed to ensure peace, cooperation, and fairness in the international order. Multilateralism, at its core, is meant to bring nations together to collectively address global challenges that no single country can resolve on its own. The idea rests on inclusivity, shared responsibility, and respect for common rules, yet in recent years the world has witnessed a steady erosion of trust in these very institutions, revealing cracks so deep that leaders like India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar have bluntly declared, "The system is failing us." This statement is not an exaggeration, but a reflection of the reality facing billions of people across the globe. One of the clearest signs of systemic failure is the inability of multilateral institutions to respond effectively to major crises. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of international health cooperation. Instead of seeing equitable distribution of vaccines, treatments, and resources, the world witnessed hoarding by richer nations and a lack of accountability in addressing global needs. Similarly, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and even the G20 struggled to craft coherent and timely responses. What emerged was a patchwork of unilateral actions, border closures, and vaccine nationalism, leaving developing countries to fend for themselves. This is exactly the kind of breakdown multilateralism was supposed to prevent. The same failures can be seen in the area of security. The war in Ukraine and the continuing instability in the Middle East have underlined how institutions like the UN Security Council are paralyzed by geopolitics. Veto powers have turned what should be a neutral decision-making body into an arena for superpower rivalry where meaningful resolutions are often blocked. As a result, global governance fails to provide even the most basic assurance of peace or justice. The rise of regional conflicts, terrorism, and cross-border aggression demonstrates that the mechanisms for collective security are no longer functioning as intended. Trade, once considered the linchpin of global cooperation, has also been severely undermined. Multilateral trade agreements were designed to ensure openness, transparency, and fairness, yet they are increasingly overshadowed by protectionist policies. The imposition of steep tariffs, especially by the United States on key trading partners like India, is symptomatic of how national interests are overriding global commitments. Instead of being governed by rules, trade has become a tool of coercion, leading to uncertainty and instability. Smaller economies that depend on predictable global frameworks find themselves at the mercy of unilateral decisions by larger powers, further deepening inequality in the system. Another dimension of failure lies in the climate crisis and the pursuit of sustainable development. Multilateral platforms such as the Paris Agreement were supposed to provide a unified roadmap for combating global warming. Yet commitments are routinely ignored, targets are missed, and the financing promised to vulnerable nations rarely materializes. The same holds true for the Sustainable Development Goals. Halfway through the timeline, progress on many of these goals has stalled or reversed. Hunger, poverty, and inequality are on the rise again, highlighting that the system is neither equipped nor motivated to prioritize the needs of the most disadvantaged. Underlying all of this is a fundamental lack of representativeness. Institutions created in the mid-20th century continue to reflect the power dynamics of that era, sidelining emerging economies and developing nations. The UN Security Council, with its permanent 5 members, is perhaps the most glaring example of this imbalance. But the same can be said of global financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, where decision-making power is concentrated in the hands of a few. In a multipolar world where Asia, Africa, and Latin America play increasingly significant roles, the persistence of outdated structures only reinforces the perception that multilateralism is an exclusive club rather than a truly global enterprise. For countries like India, the frustration is not just rhetorical, but deeply practical. When systems meant to deliver stability, justice, and cooperation instead perpetuate inequality and paralysis, the consequences are felt in trade disruptions, security threats, and developmental setbacks. The call to acknowledge systemic failure is therefore also a call to action. Reform is no longer optional, it is a necessity. If multilateralism cannot evolve to reflect present realities, nations will inevitably seek alternative frameworks such as BRICS, regional alliances, or South-South cooperation to advance their interests and safeguard their sovereignty. Acknowledging the systemic failure of multilateralism is not an end in itself, but the beginning of a much-needed reckoning. The failures we see today are not the result of one crisis or one country's actions. They are the cumulative effect of decades of inertia, exclusion, and neglect. To restore faith in global governance, nations must commit to genuine reform that ensures fairness, inclusivity, and accountability. Without such transformation, multilateralism risks becoming irrelevant, leaving the world more fragmented and vulnerable than ever before. Trade disruption by protectionism is one of the most pressing challenges to the global economic system today, and it reflects a dangerous departure from the principles of openness, fairness, and predictability that multilateral trade frameworks were built upon. Protectionism in its simplest form refers to policies that restrict imports through tariffs, quotas, or other barriers in order to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. While governments often justify such measures as necessary for protecting jobs, industries, or national security, their cumulative impact is highly destabilizing, particularly in an interconnected world where supply chains cross borders and economies depend on shared prosperity. In recent years, protectionism has reemerged with greater force, disrupting long-standing norms of global trade. A striking example is the tariff measures imposed by the United States on major trading partners, including India. Tariffs as high as 50% on key imports not only strain bilateral relations, but also create ripple effects across the global economy. When one of the world's largest economies weaponizes tariffs, it sets a precedent that encourages others to respond in kind, leading to tit-for-tat trade wars. This escalation undermines the predictability that businesses rely on to plan investments, distorts markets, and increases costs for consumers and producers alike. What was once a stable framework of trade governed by the World Trade Organization is now increasingly fragmented by unilateral measures. Protectionism also erodes the efficiency and resilience of global supply chains. Modern trade is not simply about finished goods moving across borders, but about intricate networks of production where raw materials, components, and services come together from multiple countries. Tariffs and barriers disrupt this flow, forcing companies to either absorb higher costs or pass them on to consumers. In some cases, they push firms to restructure supply chains in ways that are less efficient and more expensive. For developing economies, this disruption can be particularly devastating, as their growth often depends on integration into global value chains. By restricting access to markets and raising costs, protectionist measures threaten their ability to industrialize and create jobs. Another consequence of protectionism is the widening of inequality between nations. Larger economies may be able to withstand trade shocks by redirecting resources, but smaller and developing countries have far fewer options. When tariffs are applied, they not only lose access to critical export markets, but also face higher import costs for essential goods such as technology, machinery, or food staples. This can exacerbate trade deficits, strain foreign exchange reserves, and slow down economic growth. The very countries that multilateralism was supposed to uplift end up paying the highest price for the breakdown of open trade. The political motivations behind protectionism also reveal how it undermines trust in global systems. Leaders often use trade restrictions to appeal to domestic constituencies, framing them as measures to defend national sovereignty or revive local industries. However, the short-term political gains come at the cost of long-term global instability. For instance, imposing tariffs on a country like India may win points in domestic politics in the United States, but it risks alienating a strategic partner and damaging broader diplomatic ties. Over time, this approach corrodes the cooperative spirit that international trade depends on and encourages other nations to prioritize narrow self-interest over collective stability. Protectionism's impact extends beyond economics into geopolitics. When trade is used as a weapon, it accelerates the fragmentation of the international order into competing blocs. Countries targeted by tariffs or sanctions often seek alternative markets, alliances, and currencies to reduce their dependence on the dominant powers. This can weaken existing institutions like the WTO and accelerate the formation of parallel frameworks such as BRICS or regional trade agreements. While these alternatives may provide some relief, they also reflect a broader loss of faith in global cooperation. Instead of fostering integration, protectionism pushes the world toward division, rivalry, and inefficiency. At the same time, protectionism undermines the principles of fairness and transparency that global trade was meant to embody. Instead of being governed by clear rules, trade becomes subject to the whims of powerful actors. Developing countries which lack leverage in such confrontations are left with little recourse. This creates a perception of injustice that erodes confidence, not only in trade systems, but in the entire idea of global governance. The result is a cycle where mistrust feeds further protectionism, and protectionism deepens mistrust. The long-term dangers of protectionism cannot be overstated. It raises costs, stifles innovation, discourages investment, and weakens the spirit of international cooperation. For countries like India, which rely on stable and open markets to support economic growth and development, the stakes are particularly high. That is why voices from within BRICS and other platforms have called for fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory trade practices. By highlighting the disruptive effects of protectionism, they are not merely defending national interests, but warning of the risks of systemic collapse in global trade. If the world continues down this path, the damage to economic stability and political cooperation could be far greater than any short-term gains achieved by shielding domestic industries. The emergence of BRICS as a counterbalance in global politics and economics reflects a fundamental shift in the international order. Comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the grouping has steadily evolved from being dismissed as a loose coalition of emerging markets into a platform with real influence over global debates on trade, finance, development, and governance. Its significance has grown in proportion to the frustration many countries feel toward traditional institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, which are increasingly viewed as outdated and unrepresentative of today's multipolar world. In this context, BRICS represents not only an economic bloc, but also a political alternative that challenges the concentration of power in the hands of a few developed nations. At the heart of BRICS' role as a counterbalance is its ability to represent voices often sidelined in global decision-making. Collectively, the bloc accounts for more than 40% of the world's population and over a quarter of global GDP, yet its member states have historically had limited influence in multilateral institutions. By banding together, BRICS amplifies their collective bargaining power, allowing them to demand reforms that make global governance more inclusive and equitable. For instance, the call for reform of the UN Security Council has been consistently supported within BRICS, as its current structure disproportionately reflects the realities of the mid-20th century rather than those of the 21st century. Economically, BRICS acts as a buffer against the disruptions caused by protectionism and unilateral trade measures imposed by developed countries. When nations like the United States impose tariffs or sanctions that destabilize global markets, BRICS members find in each other alternative markets and partners. Intra-BRICS trade has grown steadily, with members striving to reduce deficits and create synergies by balancing their surpluses and shortages. This internal economic cooperation not only strengthens the resilience of member states, but also provides a model of how developing economies can thrive by pooling resources and diversifying away from dependency on a few dominant powers. The establishment of the New Development Bank's NDB is a concrete manifestation of this vision. Unlike traditional financial institutions that impose strict conditionalities, the NDB focuses on infrastructure and sustainable development projects tailored to the needs of member countries and the wider global south. The political symbolism of BRICS is just as significant as its economic initiatives. By positioning itself as a forum for dialogue outside the orbit of Western-dominated institutions, BRICS provides space for alternative narratives on global issues. For instance, while developed countries often use their platforms to push policies that prioritize their own security or financial concerns, BRICS emphasizes fairness in trade, equity in climate action, and respect for sovereignty. This contrast is particularly visible in debates around climate change, where BRICS has consistently argued that developing countries should not be forced to shoulder disproportionate burdens for a crisis largely created by industrialized nations. By uniting behind such positions, the bloc presents a cohesive challenge to the dominance of Western voices in global negotiations. BRICS functions as a counterweight to the geopolitical manipulation of trade and finance. In a world where sanctions and tariffs are increasingly weaponized, BRICS offers its members a safety net. Efforts to create payment systems independent of the dollar and to settle trade in local currencies highlight how the group seeks to reduce vulnerability to external economic coercion. This is not simply about defiance, but about building a more balanced financial order that allows developing economies to protect themselves from the volatility of Western policies. Therefore, countries that have been excluded or marginalized in the current system, BRICS serves as a platform of hope that collective strength can restore a measure of fairness to global interactions. Yet BRICS is more than just a defensive mechanism. It is also a proactive force in shaping a new world order. The group's expansion to engage with other developing nations demonstrates its ambition to grow into a broader coalition of the global south. By doing so, BRICS not only strengthens its own voice, but also ensures that the concerns of regions like Africa, Latin America, and Asia are placed at the center of global debates. The bloc's inclusive approach distinguishes it from Western alliances that often operate as exclusive clubs. This inclusivity adds to its credibility as a counterbalance, making it a more representative and legitimate forum in the eyes of much of the world. The effectiveness of BRICS as a counterbalance also lies in its ability to promote multipolarity. In contrast to a unipolar order dominated by one superpower or even a bipolar rivalry, multipolarity allows for a more distributed and balanced system of power. By strengthening their cooperation, BRICS nations reduce the dominance of any single country or bloc, thereby creating more room for equitable partnerships. This vision resonates with many developing countries that aspire to greater autonomy in their international relations. In the final analysis, BRICS' role as a counterbalance is not about confrontation for its own sake, but about correcting the imbalances of a system that has consistently marginalized the majority of the world's population. Through economic cooperation, institutional innovation, political solidarity, and a commitment to inclusivity, BRICS demonstrates that an alternative is possible. It challenges the notion that global governance must remain the monopoly of a few powerful nations and instead opens the door to a future where voices from across the globe shape decisions together. The rise of BRICS signals that the age of unquestioned dominance by a few is ending, and a new era of shared responsibility is beginning. Building resilient supply chains has become one of the defining priorities for nations and businesses in an increasingly volatile world. The concept of resilience in this context refers to the ability of supply networks to withstand shocks, recover quickly from disruptions, and continue delivering essential goods and services. Traditionally, efficiency was the guiding principle for global supply chains, with companies focusing on minimizing costs, optimizing inventory, and relying on just-in-time production models. However, recent crises from the COVID-19 pandemic and natural disasters to geopolitical conflicts and tariff wars have exposed the fragility of this system. What once seemed lean and efficient has revealed itself to be brittle and vulnerable. As a result, governments and industries alike are rethinking strategies to ensure supply chains are not only efficient, but also robust and adaptable. The pandemic provided perhaps the clearest example of how vulnerable supply chains can be. When borders closed and factories shut down, countries found themselves unable to access critical supplies, including personal protective equipment, medicines, and ventilators. Even highly developed economies were left scrambling for resources, highlighting how deeply dependent the world had become on a handful of production hubs. The disruption was not limited to healthcare. Sectors ranging from electronics to automobiles were crippled by shortages of semiconductors and other essential components. These experiences underscored the dangers of concentrating production in a few locations and the importance of diversification. A resilient supply chain must avoid over-reliance on any single source or route, ensuring that alternatives are always available when disruptions occur. Geopolitical tensions have further emphasized the need for resilience. Trade wars, tariffs, and sanctions can instantly open supply networks that took decades to build. The imposition of steep tariffs by major economies such as the United States has forced countries like India to reconsider their exposure to unilateral trade decisions. Similarly, conflicts such as the war in Ukraine have disrupted the flow of energy, food, and raw materials, sending shockwaves through global markets. For countries that rely heavily on imports of essentials like grain or fuel, these disruptions translate directly into inflation, food insecurity, and economic instability. Building resilient supply chains, therefore, requires hedging against political risks by expanding partnerships, strengthening regional trade frameworks, and investing in domestic capacity for critical goods. Another crucial aspect of resilience lies in technology and innovation. Digital tools such as blockchain, artificial intelligence, and advanced analytics can provide real-time visibility across supply chains, allowing businesses to anticipate disruptions and respond more effectively. For instance, predictive analytics can identify potential bottlenecks before they escalate, while blockchain can enhance transparency and traceability. These technologies transform supply chains from reactive systems into proactive ones, capable of adapting swiftly to changing conditions. However, the benefits of digitalization must be shared broadly, as many developing economies lack the resources to integrate such tools without international cooperation and investment. Sustainability also plays an integral role in resilience. Climate change is no longer a distant threat, but an immediate reality that disrupts supply chains through floods, droughts, wildfires, and hurricanes. A resilient supply chain must account for environmental risk and invest in sustainable practices that reduce long-term vulnerability. This includes diversifying energy sources, investing in renewable infrastructure, and reducing dependence on carbon-intensive logistics. By aligning resilience with sustainability, countries and companies can protect themselves not only from immediate shocks, but also from the systemic risks posed by a warming planet. Collaboration among nations is another pillar of building resilience. No country, however powerful, can insulate itself completely from global disruptions. Shared challenges require shared solutions. Platforms like BRICS, G20, and regional trade blocs can play an essential role in promoting cooperation on standards, stockpiling critical resources, and establishing early warning systems for supply chain disruptions. By pooling knowledge, resources, and capabilities, nations can create redundancies and backstops that prevent crises from spiraling into global breakdowns. For developing economies in particular, such collaboration offers opportunities to reduce dependency on dominant players and gain a stronger foothold in global trade. At the domestic level, governments must prioritize strategic autonomy in critical sectors. This does not mean isolationism, but rather ensuring that essential goods, such as food, energy, and healthcare products, are available locally even in times of global crisis. Policies that encourage local manufacturing, invest in infrastructure, and support small and medium enterprises are vital for building redundancy. Equally important is the creation of regulatory environments that balance the need for efficiency with the imperative of resilience. Tax incentives, subsidies, and research grants can nudge industries toward more robust models without sacrificing competitiveness. Building resilient supply chains is about balancing efficiency with security. The pursuit of the lowest cost at all times may no longer be compatible with the realities of a turbulent world. Instead, resilience demands investment in diversification, technology, sustainability, and cooperation. It requires governments to think strategically and businesses to prioritize long-term stability over short-term profits. For countries like India, resilience in supply chains is not just an economic goal, but a national security imperative, ensuring that crises, whether natural, political, or economic, do not derail development. In a multipolar and unpredictable world, the ability to build and maintain resilient supply chains will define which nations and businesses thrive and which falter. Reforming global governance has become one of the most urgent imperatives of our time, as the institutions that were created to manage international peace, stability, and cooperation increasingly appear outdated and ineffective. Global governance refers to the frameworks, organizations, and norms through which countries interact to address common challenges, from security and trade to climate change and development. For much of the post-World War II era, bodies like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization formed the backbone of this system. Yet the world of today bears little resemblance to that of 1945, when many of these institutions were founded. New powers have emerged, challenges have multiplied, and populations have grown more interconnected, but the governance structures remain largely static. The result is a widening gap between global needs and institutional capacity, a gap that demands bold and comprehensive reform. One of the most glaring flaws in the current system is the lack of representativeness. The United Nations Security Council, with its 5 permanent members holding veto power, reflects a geopolitical reality frozen in the aftermath of World War II. At that time, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France were considered the central pillars of global security. Today, however, economic and political power is far more dispersed. Nations such as India, Brazil, Germany, Japan, and South Africa have become influential actors on the world stage, yet they remain excluded from permanent representation. This imbalance undermines the legitimacy of the Security Council and fuels a perception that decisions are dominated by a few powerful nations rather than shaped by the collective will of the international community. Reforming the Council to expand membership and limit the use of the veto is essential for restoring its credibility. The economic governance structures also reflect inequities that have persisted for decades. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, though designed to promote financial stability and development, continue to give disproportionate influence to developed nations. Quota systems and voting rights heavily favor the United States and European powers, while emerging economies, despite their substantial contributions to global growth, remain underrepresented. This imbalance often leads to policies and conditionalities that prioritize creditor interests over the developmental needs of borrowing nations. Calls for reform include revising voting structures, increasing representation for developing countries, and tailoring lending practices to reflect the diverse realities of today's economies. Without such changes, these institutions risk losing their relevance as countries turn to alternative platforms like the New Development Bank or regional financial arrangements. Another area of concern is the failure of global governance to respond effectively to transnational crises. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed how fragmented and uncoordinated the international system has become. Rather than working together through the World Health Organization and other multilateral bodies, many nations chose unilateral paths, hoarding vaccines and medical supplies. This lack of solidarity not only prolonged the pandemic, but also eroded confidence in multilateralism itself. Similar failures are evident in the response to climate change. Despite ambitious pledges, implementation remains slow, financing for vulnerable nations is insufficient, and accountability mechanisms are weak. Effective governance in these areas requires more than rhetoric. It demands enforceable commitments, transparent monitoring, and equitable distribution of resources. The rise of protectionism and unilateralism further underscores the need for reform. Global trade frameworks were designed to promote openness and predictability, Yet institutions like the World Trade Organization are now paralyzed by disputes and power struggles. Instead of being governed by agreed upon rules, trade is increasingly shaped by coercion and retaliatory tariffs. Reforming trade governance means revitalizing the WTO, ensuring that dispute resolution mechanisms are functional and creating space for the needs of developing economies. It also means confronting the ways in which dominant players use economic leverage as a political weapon, destabilizing trust in the system. Technology and digital governance present another frontier where reform is overdue. Issues such as data privacy, cybersecurity, and the regulation of artificial intelligence are global in nature, yet current frameworks are fragmented and uneven. Without effective international cooperation, digital divides will deepen and powerful actors will set the rules unilaterally. Governance structures must evolve to ensure that technology serves as a force for inclusion rather than exclusion, with safeguards to protect both sovereignty and human rights. The reform of global governance is not just about making institutions more representative or efficient. It is about rebuilding trust. Nations, particularly in the global South, need to feel that their voices are heard, their interests respected, and their contributions valued. Without this trust, the legitimacy of global institutions will continue to erode, pushing countries to seek alternative arrangements outside the established system. The emergence of groupings like BRICS is a direct response to these shortcomings, offering a platform where developing nations can advocate for fairness and equity. The path to reform will not be easy. Entrenched powers are often reluctant to cede influence, and consensus among diverse nations can be difficult to achieve. Yet the cost of inaction is far greater. A world without effective governance risks descending into fragmentation, rivalry, and instability. By reforming global institutions to reflect the realities of a multipolar world, humanity has the chance to build a system that is more resilient, inclusive, and capable of addressing the challenges of the 21st century. Without such reform, the promise of multilateralism will remain unfulfilled, and the crisis we face will only deepen. The agenda for development and climate action has become inseparable in today's world as the twin challenges of poverty and environmental degradation converge to define the fate of nations. For decades, development goals focused primarily on economic growth, poverty reduction, and access to basic services, while climate action was treated as a separate, often secondary concern. Today, however, it is increasingly clear that no nation can achieve sustainable development without addressing the existential threats posed by climate change. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and resource scarcity directly undermine food security, infrastructure, health systems, and livelihoods. At the same time, development itself must be designed in ways that minimize ecological harm and promote resilience. The merging of these two agendas is not only a matter of necessity, but also an opportunity to build more just, sustainable, and future-oriented societies. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, adopted in 2015, capture this convergence by integrating climate concerns into the broader development framework. Goals such as eradicating poverty, ensuring clean water and sanitation, promoting affordable energy, and fostering sustainable cities cannot be achieved in isolation from the climate agenda. Yet, despite their ambition, progress on the SDGs has been uneven and, in many cases, has stalled or even reversed. The COVID-19 pandemic, wars, rising debt burdens, and inflationary pressures have pushed millions back into poverty, while climate-induced disasters have wiped out years of development gains in vulnerable regions. Floods in South Asia, droughts in Africa, and wildfires in North and South America highlight how climate shocks directly threaten human development, particularly for those least equipped to adapt. Financing remains one of the greatest barriers to aligning development with climate action. Developed countries have repeatedly pledged to provide climate finance to support mitigation and adaptation efforts in the global South, with commitments such as the $100 billion annual target agreed upon in the Paris Agreement. Yet these promises remain largely unmet. Many developing nations face the paradox of being among the least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, yet bearing the highest costs of climate change. They struggle with limited fiscal space, debt crisis, and competing priorities like health and education. Without significant and predictable financial support, the ambition of a sustainable development and climate agenda risks becoming hollow rhetoric. Bridging this gap requires both reform of international financial institutions and innovative mechanisms such as green bonds, blended finance, and partnerships with the private sector. Another challenge lies in the unequal distribution of responsibilities. Industrialized countries have built their prosperity on centuries of carbon-intensive growth, yet they often demand that developing nations pursue low-carbon pathways without acknowledging historical injustices. This asymmetry has fueled frustration and mistrust in climate negotiations. A fair agenda must be built on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, ensuring that while all nations contribute to the fight against climate change, the burden does not fall disproportionately on those least equipped to bear it. For countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, the priority remains achieving growth, creating jobs, and reducing inequality. Climate action must therefore be integrated into development strategies in ways that create opportunities rather than obstacles. Technology and innovation play a central role in advancing this agenda. Renewable energy, smart agriculture, resilient infrastructure, and digital tools offer pathways to both reduce emissions and accelerate development. For instance, investments in solar and wind energy not only mitigate carbon output, but also expand access to electricity in rural areas, improving education, healthcare, and productivity. Similarly, climate-smart agricultural practices enhance food security while reducing vulnerability to droughts and floods. The diffusion of such technologies, however, requires international cooperation to ensure affordability and accessibility. Without mechanisms for technology transfer and capacity building, the gap between developed and developing nations will only widen. The role of platforms like BRICS, G20, and the United Nations becomes crucial in driving a coherent global response. BRICS, in particular, has emphasized the importance of climate-resilient development, urging its members to focus on infrastructure, disaster preparedness, and sustainable finance. By creating frameworks that combine development and climate priorities, such alliances can provide alternative models of growth that resonate with the global South. Regional cooperation can also help countries pool resources, share knowledge, and build collective resilience against climate threats. Civil society and local communities must also be at the heart of the agenda. Development and climate policies imposed from the top without grassroots participation often fail to address real needs. Empowering local actors, including women, indigenous groups, and youth, ensures that solutions are inclusive and sustainable. These groups are often the most affected by climate change, but also possess unique knowledge and practices that can enhance resilience. In essence, the agenda for development and climate action represents a rethinking of what progress means in the 21st century. Growth measured solely in GDP terms is no longer sufficient if it comes at the cost of ecological collapse. Instead, a true development must be measured by the ability of societies to thrive within planetary boundaries, ensuring that future generations inherit a livable world. Achieving this vision requires political will, financial solidarity, technological innovation, and above all, a recognition that humanity's challenges are interconnected. Only by aligning development and climate action can the world hope to secure a just, equitable, and sustainable future.